Hey there! Are you a new player that's looking to learn more about how speed works in Honkai Star Rail? Or maybe you've been playing since day 1, but still have no idea on what to do with your characters when it comes to speed. I know there's already a ton of guides out there about how speed works in this game, but my guess is that you're probably here because you're still not sure about a few things. Or maybe it's more than a few things. But that's okay. I'll go through the concepts that I think are important, and we'll take it one step at a time, along with video demonstrations. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, when it comes to this whole conversation, I think the first thing that people are confused about is how their character's speed is translated to the turns that they take in battle. So in other words, how do we go from this to this? Before I start explaining, I want to make sure that you have the action value numbers enabled in the game settings. If you don't have it on, or if you're just not sure, go ahead and open up Settings, then go to the very last tab. Then under the option that says Display Character Action Value in Battle, make sure that it is set to Display. With this option turned on, you'll see these little numbers next to each teammate and enemy action on the action order bar on the left-hand side when you're in battle. So now you might be wondering what these numbers mean. This number right here is called the action value. Think of it as a measurement of time. As battle goes on, the number gets smaller and smaller until it disappears entirely. Once that number disappears, we have reached that particular character or enemy's turn. So for this example, after we take a turn with DHPT, you'll see that he'll take his next action again in another 62 action value. And this process will keep repeating. That's how turns are taken in this game. One thing that I think is worth pointing out is that time, or in this case action value, keeps on moving forward. So to backtrack a bit on this footage, we see that we're currently on Mortonak's Blade's turn, and right after that we have Soul Dragon in 4 action value. So when Soul Dragon finishes taking his turn, by the time we reach Acheron's turn, 28 total action value would have already passed. This might seem obvious at first glance, but because the battle system is presented as turn-based, it's easy to forget how much total time has passed by as a battle progresses. This will become more important in a few of the later sections in this guide. And although I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, I think it's something that's worth keeping in mind. But for now, you might be wondering how the action value number is determined for each character. Or if we take a look here, how does the game determine that DHPT right here is going to take an action after every 62 action value? It's actually pretty easy. Just divide 10,000 by the character's speed, and we'll get the action value of the character. If you're wondering what the 10,000 represents, it's called the action gauge, and you can think of it as a measurement of distance. So in other words, a character needs to travel 10,000 of these units in order to be able to take a turn. So as an example, if we take a look at Aventurine here, let's first take a look at their speed. And now we divide 10,000 by their speed, which is 135, and we'll get approximately 74.07. This is their action value. If we go into battle, we see that Aventurine here will take his turn after every 74 action value. You'll see that while the action order shows a rounded number, the game itself does take the exact decimal value into account, so do keep that in mind. In any case, this is how the game determines how frequent a character takes their turns, and for Aventurine here, this means that after every 74 action value passes, he takes a turn. Incidentally, if you ever learn how to calculate distance, speed, and time when you were in school, this is actually the exact same formula. In real life, if you divide distance by speed, you get the time. And in Honkai Star Rail, when you divide the action gauge, which is our distance, by our character's speed, we get the action value, which is the time that it would take for a character to take a turn. And if we want to put this into practice, let's run through an example. Hypothetically, let's say that we have a total of 500 action value to work with. So within the time span of 500 action value, if we're going to use the same 135 speed Aventurine that we've been using so far, how many turns can our Aventurine take? Well, first, we already know that Aventurine's action value here is 74 after we divide 10,000 by 135. So from here, let's see how many chunks of 74 action value we can fit within 500. And what we can see here is that we can fit 6 Aventurine actions within the time span of 500 action value. Unfortunately for Aventurine, his 7th action would happen at 518 AV, But at that point, we have already passed the 500 AV threshold in our example. So to answer our question, adventuring is able to fit in 6 actions within 500 action value. And by now, you might be wondering why I gave an example with a total of 500 action value to work with. This is because in Honkai Star Rail, every endgame mode except for Apocalyptic Shadow uses the concept of cycles to determine if you are clearing fast enough for maximum rewards. And in this game, every cycle consists of 100 action value each, with one exception, which is the very first cycle. This first cycle is considered by the game to be Cycle 0, and Cycle 0 contains a different amount of action value depending on the game mode that you are playing. If you're playing Memory of Chaos or Pure Fiction, Cycle 0 contains 150 action value instead of the usual 100, and if you're playing Anomaly Arbitration, Cycle 0 contains 300 action value instead of 100. If you ever wonder why Anomaly Arbitration cycles feel like they start to go by really fast after Cycle 0, it's because you can literally fit 3 normal cycles in the same amount of time that it takes to progress through Cycle 0. As a side note, for Memory of Chaos specifically, when you progress from Wave 1 to Wave 2, the amount of action value that is made available to you for your current cycle, when you enter Wave 2, will become 150 action value instead of 100, even if you're currently not in Cycle 0. This mechanic is known as the AV reset. So if you ever heard about this particular term being mentioned elsewhere, this is what it's referring to. Again, this particular mechanic only applies to Memory of Chaos and not to any of the other endgame modes. For Apocalyptic Shadow, the score counts down by the exact amount of action value that has passed since the start of the battle, so it's very straightforward. So if you ever wonder how the score is counted in this mode, now you know. By the way, if you've ever wondered where the 133.34 speed breakpoint came from, it is basically the lowest speed that you would need in order to have 2 actions over the course of 150 action value, which happens to be the duration of Cycle 0 in Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction. But to get back to the topic of why I gave an example of 500 action value to work with earlier, it's because in Anomaly Arbitration, if you're looking to get a 3-star clear with the most amount of time possible, this would be the same as achieving a 2-cycle clear. If we add up the amount of action value that is available to us for a 2-cycle clear in Anomaly Arbitration, it adds up to 500 action value. Keep in mind that unlike MOC and Pure Fiction, the 0 cycle in Anomaly Arbitration lasts 300 action value instead of 150. So yeah, that was a practical scenario that happens in the actual game. And so far, the way we calculated the number of turns that we can take is pretty straightforward, since we were literally just counting how many chunks of action value we can fit. It's not too far from counting with our fingers, but I'm keeping things simple for now. Later, I'll introduce a more efficient way to calculate the speed that we need, but first, there are a few more topics that I want to cover, and the practical considerations that you should be aware of. So next up, let's take a look at how speed changes during combat works. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Now that we know how action value determines the timing of a character's turn, you might be thinking, what happens when their speed changes during battle? And how does that affect their action value in combat? I'll be covering 2 scenarios for this one. 1, when the speed boost is applied during the character's turn, and 2, when the speed boost happens outside of the character's turn. For both of these cases, I'll use an in-game example to show what happens. Now here, we are in combat with a 160 speed Luocha and a 135 speed Aventurine. For this example, we'll use Asta's ultimate to apply a speed buff to everyone on the team. Let's first start with Luocha. You'll notice that we are currently on his turn already, so before we cast Asta's ultimate, let's check his action value. And if we take a look at the action order bar on the left hand side of the screen, you'll see that it'll take about another 63 action value to go. So let's go ahead and use Asta's ultimate. And now that we got the speed buff, you'll notice that his new action value on the action order bar is now at 47. If we check Luocha's speed in game right now, we'll see that he is on 212 speed. And that translates to around 47 action value if we divide 10,000 by 212. So the math checks out. This example is pretty straightforward since we did the speed buff during Luocha's turn, so we didn't have to take any speed changes during any sort of in-between time into consideration. But wait a minute, when we used the Asta ultimate earlier, Aventurine has not reached his turn yet. On the action order bar, before we use Asta's ultimate, Aventuring had 23 action value left to go before we reached his turn. If we replay this section, we see that after Asta used her ultimate, Aventuring's new action value remaining is now at 17. If we compare the amount of action value reduction between Luocha and Aventuring here, we see that the decrease in action value for Luocha was much greater than Aventuring's. If you want the formula on how you can calculate the action value changes, like what we saw with Aventuring's example, here it is. Practically speaking, I don't think this formula is something that I expect most people will need. But if we want to talk about what's practical, I think we should take what we have learned from Luocha's example into consideration. Like what we saw with Luocha, if we activate the speed boost on the character's own turn, then that character will get the biggest amount of action value reduction. If a speed boost is activated outside of a character's turn, then the closer we get to their next turn, like we saw with Aventuring, then the less action value reduction will happen as a result. Finally, especially for speed buffs that you might not be able to keep up perpetually like Asta's ultimate, the speed activation timing is also important in terms of how long you want the buff to last. For Asta specifically, the duration ticks down individually for each character, so be sure to take that into consideration. Just keep in mind that not all buffs are treated the same way across the board. So if you're looking at a different character that gives speed, be sure to do your research. And now that we've talked about how speed changes affect a character's action value, let's now take a look at how Action Advance works. Now, this is the part that I think most of you are probably interested in, because in this section, I will be going over how Action Advances work in this game, and that includes things like Dance 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 and 4-piece Ego Set. So let's go ahead and take a look. Now, when it comes to Action Advance, the percentage that you are advanced by is taken from the character's action value. For example, if we have an Anaxa with 117 speed, their action value will be about 85. If Anaxa is able to get a 24% action advance from, let's say, an S5 copy of Dance 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 from Tribi, then the actual amount of action value that we are advanced by would be about 20. On the action bar, what would happen is that Anaxa will jump up by 20 action value. Think of it as if the character is doing a one-time teleport up ahead. And this part is very important. It is a one-time teleport from one trigger of an action advance. It's important to keep in mind that the action advance is not applied forever. So for our example here with Anaxa, even after the action advance has happened, their own action value hasn't actually changed. It's still going to be 85. We can see that once we reach their turn, Anaxa's next turn is still going to happen in 85 action value. Another thing to keep in mind here is that Action Advance does not allow you to advance beyond 0 action value remaining. So if we go back to our Anaxa example, what would happen if we activated Dance 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 when our character has less than 20 action value remaining before we reach their turn? Let's go ahead and activate Dance 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 to find out. And as you can see right here, we are simply advanced all the way up to 0, and then we reach our turn. So now you might be wondering what happened to the leftover amount of action advance. The answer here is that they were basically wasted, and you cannot get them back. It's also worth knowing that if you activate an action advance on a character when it is already on their turn, then nothing happens, because it was already their turn to begin with. All of this means that it is very possible to waste partial action advances in combat, especially when you're playing on auto. An easy example of this would be Gallagher's ultimate. If you have his major traits that action advances him by 100% when using his ultimate, it means that if you are already on his turn and he has his ultimate available, the optimal rotation would be to first use his basic attack or skill, and then use his ultimate. That way, after his ultimate finishes, Gallagher gets to go again, which means that you're able to squeeze out an additional turn. And yes, this also means that if a character is able to fully action advance themselves with their ultimate, it would be a waste to give them things like Dance 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 or the 4-piece Eagle Relic set. So please, don't break your character for no reason. And before we continue, I need to remind all of you about something that I mentioned earlier in the action value section of the video, and it has to do with how the game itself considers when a character's turn has fully actualized. If you recall from earlier in the guide, I mentioned that once the action value number has fully disappeared from the action order bar for a character, that is when we have fully reached that character's turn. From time to time, you may sometimes see that a character's action value is 0, and that it is really close to reaching their turn. Now, repeat after me. Until the action value number is gone, it is not their turn yet. Even if it shows a 0, they can still be affected by changes that would affect their placement on the action order bar. This is why when you hit the DOT fish enemy and it reaches enough stacks, even if you have another character lined up and ready to go, the DOT fish's own action advance can overtake your upcoming character's action, because your own upcoming character's turn has not fully taken effect yet. So what does it all mean? The fish example probably gave you a hint about this, but basically, as long as there's an action value number associated with a character, they can be affected by action advance. This is the case even if that number is a 0. Remember, until the number is completely gone, it is not their turn yet. This also means that you can still manipulate the placement of your characters on the action order bar if you happen to have an action advance saved up for the occasion. In any case, I think we've covered everything that we need to know at this point. So let's take a look at how we can calculate the speed that we want for a character based on the number of turns that we want them to take. And then we can learn how to incorporate partial action advances, such as Stance and 4-piece Eagle, into our character builds. Now, a quick note before we begin. If you simply skip ahead to this timestamp on the video, I highly recommend that you watch through the earlier sections of this guide, especially if you're feeling unsure about any of the topics that we've already talked about. In any case, let's first take a look at a few popular speed breakpoints that you might have heard of, which would be 134, 160, and 200. Now, I know a lot of you would probably just look at a guide and follow it without really questioning it too much, but in this video, we're going to break down what these popular breakpoints actually mean and how we can make our own breakpoints. First, 134 speed. It's technically 133.333 repeating, so most people round it up to either 133.34 or 134. Either way, this breakpoint allows your character to take 2 actions during cycle 0 of Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction. If we divide the action gauge, which is 10,000, by our speed of 134, the result is about 74.6, which is our action value. Now, for Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction, we see that we can fit 2 of these actions within the time span of 150 action value, which is how long cycle 0 lasts in Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction. Likewise, for 160 speed, this is the breakpoint that will allow a character to take 4 actions over the course of cycle 0 and cycle 1 of Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction. And finally, 200 speed allows your character to take 3 actions over the course of cycle 0 in Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction. But what if I wanted to perform the calculation differently? What if we want to get the speed that we need and we already know how many actions we want to take in a specific amount of cycles? Well, here's the answer. This little formula will tell us the speed that we need, and we'll walk through a few examples together. So for our first example, let's say that we're looking to hit 6 turns over the course of cycle 0, cycle 1, and cycle 2 of Memory of Chaos. Maybe you're not 100% interested in doing 0 cycles, but you have a well-built team and you're looking to see if it's possible to squeeze out 6 actions out of a support character for a comfortable 2-cycle clear. In that case, we'll take our formula and we'll go ahead and start with multiplying 6 by 10,000, which gives us 60,000. From here, we determine the amount of action value that we have available to us. Since we're talking about Memory of Chaos, cycle 0 gives us 150 action value, cycle 1 gives us 100, and cycle 2 also gives us another 100. Adding all of that together, we get 350 action value that we have available. So from here, we'll go ahead and divide 60,000 by 350, and our result here is around 171.43. So in this example, we'll want to hit 171.43 speed or higher in order to reach our goal. Now, for our second example, let's say that we're looking to hit 10 turns over the course of cycle 0, cycle 1, and cycle 2 of Anomaly Arbitration. This can be relevant if you're looking to secure a 3-star clear on the night stage, and you feel like you want more turns out of a support that you're running on your team. So if we take the same formula here, we'll first multiply 10 by 10,000, which gives us 100,000. From here, we determine the amount of action value that we can work with. In this case, for Anomaly Arbitration, cycle 0 is 300 action value, cycle 1 is another 100, and cycle 2 is another 100. So altogether, that's 500 action value. We'll then go ahead and divide 100,000 by 500, and the result that we get is 200. So in this example, we'll want to hit 200 speed in order to reach 10 actions from the beginning of cycle 0 to the end of cycle 2 in anomaly arbitration. I think at this point, it's pretty easy to see that even if we're not aiming for 0 cycles specifically, the formula gives us the freedom to find any speed breakpoint that we want. But with that being said, you might be wondering why some of the more common speed breakpoints, such as 134 and 200, are widely popular, even though they are inherently meant for 0 cycling. Now, for me, I think the reason is because of the amount of extra action value that is available in cycle 0. Think about it. Every other cycle only gives you 100 action value each, but cycle 0 gives you more room to work with. In Memory of Chaos, the action value reset mechanic also extends the usefulness of working within 150 action value, which essentially allows you to take advantage of it twice during one run. And in Anomaly Arbitration, cycle 0 gives you 300 action value. Even if you only care about a 2-cycle clear in Anomaly, cycle 0 alone already takes up 3/5 of the total amount of time that you have available to you if you care about a 3-star clear. Therefore, even if you're not consciously aiming for 0 cycles, I think there's a practical merit to speed tuning for them, simply because of the extra time that you can take advantage of. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, it's nice to be able to hit 200 speed, but it's simply too difficult. I simply cannot roll speed values that high. What else can I do? And if that's something that's been bugging you, I have a solution for you. Let me introduce you to my friends Dance 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 and 4-piece Eagle set. Both of these allow for a partial action advance to happen when the wearer uses their ultimate, and as we demonstrated in the action advance section earlier, being able to perform these one-time teleports during battle can be quite impactful, assuming that we don't run into any skill issues and that we don't waste our advances. If this sounds confusing, I highly recommend that you go back and watch the action advance section of the guide before you continue. In any case, how do we incorporate partial action advances into our speed calculations? Well, if we assume that we don't waste any partial action advances that we get during combat, here's the answer. We'll walk through a few examples together to make this easier to understand. Of course, if you don't know what I meant by wasting action advances, I highly recommend that you go back and watch the action advance section of the video again for more details. But for now, let's go ahead and take a look at some examples. So for our first example, let's say that we have an Ashvale that recently replaced their Sunday for Mortonak's Blade in his team. Previously, the Ashvale was running a 135 speed build to complement the 134 speed Sunday that they previously had. But now that Sunday is gone, maybe you've decided to just go with attack boost to maximize Ashvale's damage, since everyone else on the team can contribute hit frequency. But one of those teammates is Stribby, and she happens to be using a copy of S5 Dance Dance Dance. And you might be wondering if the Dance 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 can make up for the missing speed. Or even if it doesn't make up for the missing speed entirely, perhaps you want to know if adding a little bit of extra speed on top might make a difference. So with that in mind, we first identify the goal that we're trying to reach, which in our case is being able to take 2 turns within cycle 0 of Memory of Chaos. So in other words, we're trying to recreate the 134 speed breakpoint with some partial action advances taken into account. So just like before, since we wanted to be able to take 2 turns, we multiply that by the action gauge of 10,000, which gives us 20,000. Before we do any sort of division against the action value of cycle 0, we'll take this moment to apply the action advance that we're getting. In this case, it will be 1 activation of S5 Dance 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 from our teammate, which contributes a 24% action advance. So we'll go ahead and multiply 0.24 by 10,000, which gives us 2,400. From this point, we can follow the formula and do 20,000 subtract 2,400, which gives us 17,600. Now we can proceed with dividing our new result by the amount of action value that's available to us, which is 150 in our case. And after we divide 17,600 by 150, we get 117.34. So as long as someone on the team activates S5 Dance 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 at least once over the course of cycle 0, and that the action advance is not wasted, we can guarantee that our Ashvale is able to take 2 turns during cycle 0 if he has 117.34 speed or higher. In a way, we're letting Ashvale reach the effective 134 speed breakpoint without actually having to build 134 speed. For our second example, we'll go with Sparkle. Let's say that up to this point, you've been running a 160 speed build and you've been able to take 2 actions during cycle 0, but you decided that you want to hit the next threshold for cycle 0, which is 200 speed. Let's also say that our Sparkle here is at E1, which gives her a 15% speed boost, but even with our E1, it's been hard trying to reach 200 speed. And if we want to throw a curveball at our example, let's also say that the only copy of Dance 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 that we can spare is at S1, because the S5 copy that we have is being used by somebody else. So given our situation, we'll go ahead and also use the 4-piece Eagle set to see if it's possible for us to go with a lower actual speed and still be able to hit our target of 3 turns within cycle 0 of Memory of Chaos. Let's go ahead and check the formula and we'll go step by step. First, we take our 3-turn goal and multiply that by 10,000. Then, for our action advance sources, we have S1 Dance 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 and the 4-piece Eagle set. The S1 Dance 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 gives us 16%, and Eagle gives us 25%. So altogether, we're looking at a combined 41% action advance. We'll go ahead and load all of that information into the formula like we see here on the screen. So after we calculate all of that, the next iteration of the formula will look like this. We'll have 30,000 minus 4,100, which gives us 25,900. We'll then divide it by 150, which is the amount of action value in cycle 0 of Memory of Chaos, and we'll get about 172.67. But wait, we also have E1 on Sparkle for the 15% speed boost. So let's go back and take the E1 into consideration as well. Sparkle's base speed is 101, which means that a 15% speed boost gives us plus 15.15 speed. So if we take our 172.67 result from earlier and subtract it by 15.15, we'll get 157.52. This means that if our E1 Sparkle is wearing 4-piece Eagle set and a copy of S1 Dance Dance Dance, we just need her to reach 157.52 speed or higher in order to be able to take 3 turns over the course of cycle 0 of Memory of Chaos, assuming that we do not waste any of our action advances. At the very least, it's a lot easier than trying to hit 200 speed purely from relics, and that's what partial action advances from sources like Dance 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 and Eagle Set can do for us. By the way, I know I already mentioned this in the action advance section of the guide earlier, but as a quick reminder, if a character's ultimate gives them 100% action advance, do not use Eagle or Dance Dance Dance. It will be wasted. Now, from all of these examples, one thing that you've probably realized is that the action advances that we take into consideration is all dependent on how many times we can activate them. The examples that I gave were all on the conservative side, which is just 1 activation over the course of cycle 0, but don't assume that this is going to be the case for everyone. Some characters, especially those that can cast their ultimates quickly, like Kafka on the tutorial light cone, can easily pull off at least 2 ultimates over the course of 150 action value. So the calculations can definitely differ depending on the situation. I think this is worth pointing out so that you don't always go into calculating partial action advances with the impression that it's only going to be 1 activation every single time. Another thing that I want to mention is the Von Whack Planner set. This set gives us a one-time 40% action advance at the beginning of combat. It's a very useful set to have, especially if you're having trouble speed tuning certain characters on the team. For example, if you're running a Silver Wolf 999 team, and you're having trouble with making your Yao Guang to be faster than your Silver Wolf, you can give the Von Whack Planner to Yao Guang so that she can overtake Silver Wolf during her very first turn. This set can also make hitting a lower actual speed much more easily, but I think it's important to remember that Von Whack only works once at the beginning of combat. This limitation means that in Memory of Chaos, once you finish the first wave of enemies and you move on to the second wave of the actual boss, Von Whack will not be able to activate again. So if there are certain breakpoints that you want to reach during the second wave of Memory of Chaos, just remember that Von Whack will not be able to help you there. Now you may also have noticed that I didn't touch upon temporary speed changes. The main reason is because it is a huge pain to incorporate into your team's rotation. If you want to calculate and time everything manually, definitely feel free to do so, but it is outside of my scope. In addition, I would say that at this point of the game's lifespan, temporary speed changes have become more and more niche. Asta saw a brief resurgence during Cyrene and Silver Wolf 999's debuts, but I would argue that they're definitely not a mainstream pick, and they're not something that I will worry about too much. Besides, the game has introduced more and more speed boost effects that end up becoming more or less permanent as long as you're able to maintain their uptime. So that becomes one less thing to worry about. Just keep in mind that for speed boosts that don't happen at the beginning of combat, be sure to remember to take the downtime into consideration. To give an example of this, let's say that we have Hycealins at E0S1. Her signature light cone gives 10% speed, but only after Hycealins lands an attack on a debuff enemy. If we're trying to hit an effective 134 speed for Cycle 0 of Memory of Chaos, you might think that we can take the 10% speed boost into account, which translates to an additional 10.2 speed, but our math would be wrong, because if we simply went with 123.8 speed outside of combat, what happens is that Hycealins' first action will take about 80.8 action value at 123.8 speed, and her second action will happen at around 74.6 action value at 134 speed. But if you add up the action value totals, it actually exceeds 150 action value, because between the time the battle began up to the time that Hycealins' first turn ended, we were too slow. However, if E0S1 Hycealins is at 129 speed, then the first turn will take about 77.52 action value, and the second turn at 139.2 speed will take about 71.84 action value. If we add these two together, we can see that the two turns took a total of 149.36 action value, which fits perfectly within the 0 cycle of Memory of Chaos. So if you find yourself dealing with any sort of speed buff that don't happen right from the beginning of battle, definitely try to take these delays into consideration. Lastly, I've had some people ask about how I would determine the speeds that I will want to build on a character. While speed tuning isn't something that's directly related to the speed mechanics of the game, I do want to take a moment to cover the topic. So without further ado, let's take a look at an example and get right into it. Now, when it comes to determining the speeds that you want for an entire team, I think it's helpful to have an idea of the turn order that you want to implement first. Let's go ahead and use an archer team as an example. Now, without worrying about anyone's speed at all, how do we first want the rotation to look like? In other words, what's the order that we want our characters to take? If you were to ask me, then I will want to start with DHPT and Silverwolf, followed by Sparkle, and lastly, Archer. Between DHPT and Silverwolf, it wouldn't really matter who would go first, but I would definitely want these two to go before Sparkle. Because if you think about it, if Sparkle goes first, then she will action advance Archer, which means that your Archer is going to miss out on the turns that DHPT and Silverwolf would have taken. Both of these characters could have given us extra skill points from their basics, or if we needed them to do their skills, we would have missed out on those as well. So for this example, let's say that the order that we want would be DHPT, Silverwolf, Sparkle, and then Archer in that order. Now we can decide on the speeds that we want for each character, while also sticking to the turn order that we decided on. First of all, how will our DPS be able to take the actions that he needs? I would say that for Archer, he will be mostly dependent on Sparkle to give him the action advances that he needs. Therefore, we don't necessarily need to build speed on Archer himself. As long as Sparkle is fast enough, I think that would be good enough. And if we don't care too much about zero cycling, I think 160 speed will work out great for our Sparkle. 160 speed will allow Sparkle to take 4 actions over the course of Cycle 0 and Cycle 1 in Memory of Chaos, and in Anomaly Arbitration, 160 speed will allow her to take 8 actions over the course of Cycles 0, 1, and 2, which is enough to secure a 3-star clear on the night stage. Now that we have decided on the speed for Sparkle, we should decide on what we want for all of our other teammates. Remember earlier when I mentioned that DHPT and Silverwolf should be faster than Sparkle? That basically answers the question of what speeds we would need for each of those characters to reach. As long as they were faster than 160, we can guarantee that they can take their turns before Sparkle does. This works for our Silverwolf, but you might be wondering if this is necessary for DHPT, since one of his major traits gives him a 40% action advance at the start of combat. Now, you might be thinking, isn't that a built-in Von Whack effect? And the answer to that is yes. However, while you can make the argument that the Von Whack effect alone is enough to not require DHPT to go all that fast, It's also true that in Memory of Chaos, the effect doesn't trigger once you enter Wave 2. And in most cases, Wave 2 would be the more challenging wave that contains the actual boss that you'll be fighting against. And having a proper rotation there is pretty important as well. So in a nutshell, you should first get an idea of how you want your team rotation to look like. And then you can determine the speed of each team member based on how many actions you want them to take in a given amount of time. The tricky part is that different teams have different things to look out for. And even for teams that have identical teammates, the speed tuning can be very different depending on the amount of eidolons and signature light cones that we're dealing with. If you're unsure about what you want to do for a particular team, you can always start with looking up guides, but definitely keep an open mind. As you start to play with the team a bit more, ask yourself about whether you wished a certain character can take their turns before a different teammate, and from there, you can try to experiment with different speed tunings to see if you can end up getting a rotation that you like better. At the end of the day, don't treat this guide as the end game as far as speed is concerned. This is all just the beginning. My hope with this video is to give you the information that you need to get started so that you can become better equipped to do your own theory crafting and speed tuning with the characters and resources that you have. And if you made it this far, congratulations, you've made it to the end of the speed guide. This took quite some time for me to put together, so if you found this video to be helpful and informative, be sure to like and subscribe. Let me know if you have any thoughts in the comments below. I also stream on Twitch on a weekly basis with an emphasis on Honkai Star Rail gameplay and endgame, so feel free to check out the link in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all on the next one.